in many ways the ultimate tribute to Reagan's pragmatism, because few would have expected that this hardline anti-communist who had been warning about the dangers of the Soviet Union since the 1940s, that he would be establishing a friendship with the world's number one communist and working so constructively with him. But that is in fact what Reagan did.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is late 1932, come Christmas time. A young man, Ronald Reagan, is visiting Springfield, Illinois. His father, Jack, is running a shoe store to maintain what he can of an income for the family. It is the very, very, very dark days of the United States in what becomes the Great Depression. This is a moment when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the disabled governor of New York, has been elected president, but it won't be until March that he takes office. Everything is dire, and we know that the banks are going to fail. So there is no prosperity anywhere. And yet Ronald Reagan records later what he saw of his father deeply, deeply hurt him. And he cried. I welcome a man who's told this story and all the others, his life and legend, Reagan, Max Boot. Max and I have history 20 years ago when Max was at the Wall Street Journal and he visited Iraq and came back and reported to me. So it's a great pleasure to welcome him to this show. After all these years, he's devoted to Ronald Reagan, away from his family, and now he gets to talk about it. Max, congratulations. A very good evening. Jack and Ron Reagan in that store that Reagan describes as a hole in the wall. What was Reagan's thoughts? Who was Jack? What do we need to know about his father? Good evening to you.
Yeah, good evening, and thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to talk about the book, and we can begin by, as you suggest, by talking about Jack Reagan, Ronald Reagan's father. And Jack was this kind of ne'er-do-well Irish-American shoe salesman who had a great gift of blarney, very charming, great raconteur, but his great weakness was demon rum, and he was an alcoholic, major drinking problem, and that contributed to a lot of the misery of Ronald Reagan's childhood, because Jack Reagan dreamed of opening his own shoe emporium, but instead he kept losing one job after another, and the family kept moving from one place to another. And this, created a sense of dislocation in little Dutch Reagan's life, as Reagan was known when he was young, and meant that he never stayed in one place for very long, and he never really got close to the other kids, in part because he had this family secret. He didn't want people to know about his father's drinking. And so that fostered a remoteness, this mental barrier that he erected against other people from his earliest days of childhood. And it also led to his aversion to personality conflict. And we think of Reagan as being somebody who could be very confrontational in his politics, which was true. But in his private life, he was very non-confrontational, in part because, he had seen so much confrontation as a boy between his father, Jack, and his mother, Nelly, who obviously was not very happy when Jack would go and spend the family's rent money on alcohol or disappear for days at a time on a bender. And so there were a lot of arguments through the thin walls of their rented houses. And Jack really reached his low point at the same time as the rest of the country reached their low point in 1932, as you alluded to, when he was working far from the family's home in Dixon, Illinois. He was working in Springfield, Illinois, and presiding over a decrepit shoe store that Ronald Reagan visited, and was very depressed to see the straits that his father was in. And even that didn't last long, because within a few weeks, Jack Reagan was fired and was out of work like millions of other Americans. And so that was really a very low point in his life and the family's life, along with that of the rest of the country.
Ronald Reagan was born in a winter storm in 1911, and he has the nickname Dutch because the remark was made by his father. He was a cheerful, chubby little baby boy, so he was called a fat Dutchman by his father, and Dutch is the nickname that stuck in his youth. We need to introduce his mother, Nelly. Disciples of Christ extremely admirable Protestant marrying a man who did not practice his Roman Catholic religion. What do we need to remember about her as a young person caring for the children that inspired Reagan later?
Well, Nelly Reagan was very religious, and you know, Dutch Reagan, her son, grew up in her faith, the disciples of Christ. Uh, but while she was very religious, and she was really a do-gooder. I mean, she was somebody who spent all of her time ministering to patients at the hospital or inmates at the prison. She was somebody who was really committed to community service, but she was also in many ways a frustrated actress. And so from a very early age, uh, Dutch Reagan and his brother Moon were being cast as extras in the plays that Nelly Reagan put on at community centers, at churches, these small halls throughout these small towns of the Midwest. And when when his ghostwriter for his post-presidential memoir was trying to push him for kind of a rosebud moment, some clue that unlocked who he became as from his childhood. He really struggled to find anything. But one thing he remembered was at age 10 or 11, being put on a stage by Nelly Reagan and liking the sound of the applause that he heard. So he kind of became an addict, addicted to the applause of the audience. I think one other legacy from Nelly that is worth emphasizing is that she was a relentlessly positive, upbeat, optimistic, even Pollyannish person. She believed you always have to look on the sunny side of life and you can overcome any adversity. And that was incredibly integral to Ronald Reagan's psyche. He himself became extremely positive, upbeat, optimistic, to an extent that even frustrated, his future wife, Nancy, or others, because they thought that he was ignoring some dismal realities. But that was really his legacy from Nelly, and it's what allowed him to cope with his very difficult childhood. And he always put a very positive gloss on his childhood and remembered it as a quote unquote Huck Finn idol. Whereas in fact, it was a very difficult, even traumatic childhood. The family was very poor, the father losing one job after another, dealing with his alcoholism. But he always looked on the bright side of life, just as his mother Nellie had taught him.
In 1926, 27, and afterwards, Ron Reagan, 15 years old, Dutch Reagan, wins a job thanks to his father's introduction for the Graybills to be a lifeguard at a community pool, a community river.
Yeah,
And I read that, Max, as extremely determinative of how he thought of himself, both admired and necessary. Is that a clue to what he becomes later?
absolutely. And this was a very formative experience for him. He spent most of his high school and college years in the summers working as a lifeguard on the Rock River. And during that time, he saved 77 people from drowning. And there are cynics of a later age who question that claim and suggest that maybe that there were some girls who just feigned drowning to be rescued by this handsome lifeguard. But in fact, I mean, I researched it as best as I could, and I concluded that he really had saved 77 people, and he became kind of a small town hero because of that. And I think that gave him a taste of what it was like to be renowned, admired, to be useful to the community. And Reagan himself was never very self-reflective. He was a very frustrating subject for interviewers. But I found a remark that he made in the late 1930s to a movie fan magazine. And by the way, movie fan magazines were one of my best sources on Ronald Reagan's life because they were just such fascinating vignettes before he entered politics. But he made this comment to a movie fan magazine where he talked about why he liked being a lifeguard so much. And what he said was he liked sitting up on this high chair with everybody looking up at him. And I thought that was very revealing of his psyche.
Author of a new biography of Ronald Reagan, Max Boot, His Life and Legend. The father, in the low point of his life in 32, has a job as an administrator of welfare for the New Deal in late 33. Jack is a troublesome person, but at the same time, he has his moments as men who are suffer with addiction do. And became very prominent in the town because he was the person to go to for money or or loans. At the same time, his son is developing into a bright young football star at Eureka College who's in love with a young woman whose father is a pastor, the Cleavers. What do we need to know about his early romance with the Cleavers, Max?
Well, Margaret Cleaver, whom he always called Muggs, was his steady girlfriend throughout high school and college. And part of the reason why he, in fact, attended Eureka College was to be with Margaret, who went to college there. And they were passionately in love. They were engaged to be married. Reagan thought he would spend his whole life with her. And then after graduation, they moved apart, and he was crushed when she returned his engagement ring, and she had made a trip to Europe and fell in love with this American diplomat in Europe who became eventually left the Foreign Service, became a lawyer, and they settled in happy anonymity in Richmond, Virginia. And of course, Reagan went on to greater glory. But Margaret was very influential with him, and so was her father, the Reverend Cleaver. He was almost like a surrogate father to Dutch Reagan, and he had a series of surrogate fathers. And the Reverend Cleaver obviously was a pillar of the community, somebody who was obviously very religious. And I think, along with Reagan's mother, he helped to infuse Reagan with some of his faith, and provided, much needed ballast for him in dealing with the storms occasioned by his alcoholic father.
Dutch Reagan can tell stories. Dutch Reagan has a magnificent voice for telling stories. It's compelling. It, it welcomes you. And this is a young man, and he turns to radio, which we're on right now, Max.
Yes.
He loved radio right away. It was his favorite modality. Why? What did he see in it?
Well, remember that in the early 1930s, I mean, Reagan graduated from college in 1932. At that time, that was the pre-television age. Radio was the mass communications medium along with movies. And Reagan's ultimate goal was to get into the movies because he was a pretty successful actor in high school and in college, and in his high school and college drama clubs. But, for a poor boy graduating from a tiny college in the Midwest in the height of the Great Depression, going to Hollywood was as remote as going to the moon. He had no idea of how to get there. And so, but he very shrewdly figured out that while there were no movie studios in the Midwest, there were a lot of radio stations. And so he decided to take out that this would be an outlet for his theatrical talents. And he wound up getting a job at a radio station in Davenport, Iowa. And very soon he was so successful that he was transferred to a much larger and more powerful station in Des Moines, where he became known throughout the Midwest as Dutch Reagan, the voice of the Chicago Cubs and the White Sox. He became a very successful sportscaster. This was like, the 1930s version of ESPN. He became a regional person of renown, and was doing very successfully in the height of the Great Depression, even before he moved to Hollywood.
He also had a talent of being able to tell a story without actually seeing the game. It's a magical story that I remember being told early on when I first dealt with Ronald Reagan as an actor. And growing up in the 50s and 60s, he was on movies, a famous movie, sometimes with Errol Flynn in the Second War, very heroic figure, not what you'd call a dark leading man, somebody capable of Flynn to being self-centered. He was always sunny, even especially in Hollywood. And let's go right to Hollywood. He was B-list at Warner's. What did that mean, Max?
Well, in those days, there were A-list pictures and B-list pictures. The A-list pictures, as the name implies, were the ones that cost the most, had the biggest stars, the best production. Those were the kind of the headlining pictures. But, and this is really taking us back to a long lost era of movie going. But, in the 30s and 40s, people would go to their local movie house, and not just to see one picture. They would see a newsreel, and they would see a cartoon, and they would see a B-list picture or a short, and then they would see the A picture. And so the B pictures were the much cheaper, hokier, shorter fare that the studios churned out. to release along with their more expensive pictures. And Reagan initially started out in these B pictures, and he did, for example, a series of pictures playing brass Bancroft Treasury agent T-Man, which I would not recommend to anybody. I watched those movies, and they're pretty horrifically bad, especially to anybody who's used to, the current level of production from the movie industry. I mean, the special effects were so hokey, so cheap, but people liked it in the late 1930s. It provided an escape from their own troubles. And, people would just go and spend an evening at the movies and often watching Ronald Reagan in the dark.
The movie career pays well, and he's doing extremely well. I think he moves his parents out to Hollywood, takes very good care of them. His father died in 41.
Right.
Uh, his mother lived all into the 60s. His brother is also in Hollywood as an actor and then eventually as an agent. So Ronald Reagan is very responsible to his family. And he is a young, very handsome actor, recognized by the fan magazines. And he meets another young actor who will be determinative in his opinion of himself. Her name, Jane Wyman. His life and legend, Reagan, story of Ronald Reagan. It's Hollywood. It's 1948. And in a movie that they star in together, he meets a woman named Jane Wyman, who's been in Hollywood for a number of years. She comes from the Midwest, as Ronald Reagan does, and she is a femme fatale. She will become one of the great actresses of this period. Not when she meets Reagan, however. She's still in B movies. Max, I can't figure this marriage out. Can you? It is an odd combination.
Well, it sort of makes sense because Jane Wyman had come out to Hollywood at a very early age, and as you can imagine, for an attractive actress of that era, it was a very difficult life, right? I mean, she had to be constantly fighting off people who were trying to get her onto the casting couch. This was, the long before the Me Too era. It was you really had to be very tough and deal with a lot of traumatic things to be an actress. And I think part of what attracted Jane Wyman to part of the reason why Jane Wyman was attracted to Ronald Reagan was because he was such a nice guy. He was not a guy who would take advantage of her. He was kind of her white knight. He was always a gentleman, or so she thought. And he was somebody who would kind of protect her from the predators in Hollywood. And she, he was also, very easy on the eyes. He was a very handsome guy. He was touted as a beefcake in the movie magazines of the late 1930s, and so she fell for him and wanted to marry him, but found that, as others were defined, it was very hard to get Ronald Reagan to commit. He was, happy to hang out with Jane Wyman, and he had kind of a rat pack of friends from the Midwest and who followed him to L.A. and she hung out with them, but he wasn't that eager to march down the aisle, and so she had to undertake a campaign to get him to commit, which included feigning interest in the outdoorsy activities that he loves so much. And finally, he gave in, and they got married. And
Two children followed, and
yes,
we need to note here that there's about to be a rupture in Ronald Reagan's life that introduces him into becoming a libertine for a time. And that is Jane Wyman getting apart, realizes that her career is taking off, though she's had two children and she's married, and that career will blossom. She becomes one of the great actresses of her era. Her big break is Lost Weekend, about an alcoholic played by Ray Milland. There's irony within every biography, Max, and you find it. My,
yes.
my goodness. However, we need to get to the politics of Hollywood at this point. Does the divorce rock Reagan so that he moves into the Screen Actors Guild, or was that happening at the same time of the divorce?
It was happening at the same time. We're moving ahead a few years. What happened was on the eve of World War II, when Reagan was marrying Jane Wyman, Reagan's star was really ascending. He was, making movies like Newt Rockney, All American. He was, being given equal billing with Errol Flynn and other top Warner Brothers stars. So he was actually ascending to the A-list. But then the the war derailed his career, even though he never went anywhere. He spent the entire World War II in Hollywood and Culver City making propaganda and training films for the Air Force, but he wasn't making commercial movies. And by the time the war ended in 1945 and Reagan got out, he did not find as much of a market for his movie making as he had before the war. And so he was, there were other actors, John Wayne and Gregory Peck and others who were overshadowing him. And so without much demand for his services at the studio, he became more active in the Screen Actors Guild and Hollywood politics, and he gave a lot of speeches on politics. And at that time, he was a very idealistic liberal, still a New Dealer. But he and Jane Wyman were going in opposite directions because Jane's career, as you were alluding to, was taking off after the war. She was going from the B list to becoming an Oscar-winning actress, one of the leading actresses in Hollywood. And she was intensely focused on her acting career and was not really interested in politics, which was increasingly what Reagan was interested in. And so they just kind of drifted apart.
The politics of the moment had to do with Congress and the search for communists everywhere, especially in Hollywood, that made spectacular hearings before Congress. This is HUAC, the House Un-American Activities. And Ronald Reagan was, I believe it was an unpaid job, but not paid very well, to be president of the Screen Actors Guild. I couldn't tell because he's so, it's difficult to know where he was on this. He didn't protect anybody, but at the same time, did he throw himself into the investigation? Did he become a red hunter? How to present where he was in the politics of the moment?
He navigated the treacherous politics of the McCarthy era very skillfully. He testified before the House Un-American Affairs Committee and actually sounded like a liberal. And he said that, he didn't believe that the Communist Party should be banned. He refused to name names of suspected communists, unlike many of his peers in the movie industry. And he was actually applauded by liberal journalists. But at the same time, quietly behind the scenes, he was acting as an FBI informant, and he was providing names to the FBI and even privately telling the FBI that he thought that the Communist Party should be banned. And so he basically managed to cover both his left and right flanks. And a lot of people had their lives destroyed by the witch hunt era of red hunting. But Reagan's career was actually enhanced by the way that he skillfully navigated those politics.
The divorce is 1948. At one point, Max says that Reagan was running up $750 bills at nightclubs in one night. And
Yes.
at that point, is he drinking heavily? Can we tell? Does he have the problem his father had?
No, I don't think he ever drank heavily. He was always afraid of alcohol based on his father's experience. And his typical pattern would be to nurse a single cocktail through the evening. But this was the one period of his life where he was womanizing. And you don't think of Ronald Reagan, the ultimate family man or the ultimate husband, as being a womanizer. But he was after Jane Wyman divorced him. And it was really Jane's initiative to divorce him. He was shocked by that and kind of left adrift and went through a series of hookups with various Hollywood actresses before Nancy Davis finally appeared in his life.
Nancy Davis, very important figure here. She is not going to be an actress, but she starts out in that direction. This marriage makes sense, and they were very, very keen on each other right away. There's a photograph in Max's book that tells you everything you need to know about how Nancy listened to Ron Reagan, who was a wonderful raconteur, could talk on many subjects. At the same time, you need to know the rest of Max's book makes it very clear that Nancy's in charge. Did he know that? Did that relax him? Is she Nelly?
Yes, he needed a strong woman in his life, and Nelly, his mother, had looked out for him when he was younger, and that was kind of the role that Nancy Reagan assumed for herself. And she was, although Nancy had a movie career, she was not nearly the actress that Jane Wyman was, and she didn't want to be an actress. She wanted to be a wife and a mother, and her thinking was that if she continued her career, she might lose her husband, as Jane Wyman and Ronald Reagan had split up, and that was the last thing that Nancy wanted. And so she threw herself into being kind of the perfect wife. Now, she was not a perfect mother, and they had a kind of a tortuous and even dysfunctional family dynamics. And Nancy completely did not get along with her daughter, Patty Davis, and that was a lifelong source of pain to both of them. And she did not really get along well with her husband's kids from his first marriage, Michael and Maureen Reagan. But her priority was her husband and doing everything possible to further Ronald Reagan's career. And I think she was absolutely integral to that, not only because she was such a supportive and helpful partner, but because she also became a fairly shrewd political figure. And as one of Reagan's aides told me, Nancy Reagan was really the HR department of Reagan Inc. She was the person who often hired and fired on his behalf. And a lot of that is due to their very different personalities, because Ronald Reagan, as we've been discussing, was very sunny, very upbeat, always saw the best in everybody, whereas Nancy Reagan was totally different. She was a worrywart. She assumed everybody was out to get him unless proven otherwise. And so she kind of developed these protective instincts that greatly aided Reagan's political rise.
Television. Max Boot is the author of Reagan, His Life and Legend. I believe it's Mike Deaver later in the White House who says television is the presidency. And we're about to see that demonstrated. There's a General Electric Theater. There's Borax, the 21 Mule. I remember that vividly, Max, and black and white. Ronald Reagan is a perfect TV presenter. The movie career is unnecessary. He's earning very, very good money from GE and from mixing with corporate leadership in the 50s and early 60s. But we need to get back to politics. Politics can push the audience away. However, he became attached to what becomes the Goldwater part of the early Republican conservative movement. What convinced him? Was it talking to GE executives? Is that why he went from New Dealer to Goldwaterite?
Well, Reagan's own explanation was he often said, I didn't desert my party deserted me, to imply that the Democratic Party had veered far to the left and he had stayed in the center. And as I show in the book, that's not really accurate, because the Democratic Party in the 1950s was still pretty centrist. I mean, in 1960, John F. Kennedy actually ran to Richard Nixon's right on defense policy. So it wasn't the Democrats who had changed, it was Reagan. And I trace the transformation beginning in World War II, when still as a very highly paid actor, Ronald Reagan was very unhappy to be paying 90% rates of income taxation during the war. And then after the war, as we discussed, he became involved in the red hunts in Hollywood and became a very hardline anti-communist. And then his transformation was really complete in the 1950s, when he was a spokesman for General Electric and host of the General Electric Theater, because in those days, GE was a very conservative company, and they viewed spreading, free market propaganda as being an inoculation against union troubles. And so they made sure that all of their managers and employees were exposed to a host of conservative viewpoints. And Ronald Reagan himself was a very avid reader, and he had a lot of time to read, because in those days he was afraid to fly, and so he would take the train from LA to New York to speak on behalf of GE. And during these long train rides, he would be reading National Review or Human Events or Hayek or Whittaker Chambers or others. And so he became a very staunch conservative by the early 1960s, and wound up becoming a prominent supporter of Barry Goldwater's in 1964, moving very far from his New Deal roots as an avid FDR supporter in the 1930s.
The campaign of 1964 won handily by Lyndon Johnson, the vice president who accepted the role of president after the assassination of Jack Kennedy. The speech, what is that? What are we talking about when we talk about the speech, Max?
The speech was this national television address that Ronald Reagan delivered on behalf of Barry Goldwater a few weeks before the 1964 election. The campaign bought half an hour of airtime for Reagan to deliver the speech, which was called a time for choosing, but became known simply as the speech. And it was really Ronald Reagan's debut on the national political stage. And it was this brilliant piece of oratory that, in fact, in many ways, overshadowed Barry Goldwater because Reagan made the case for Goldwater better than Goldwater could make it for himself. And the thing that people were shocked to see this Hollywood actor, speaking so fluently about politics. And what they didn't realize is he'd actually been honing that speech for a decade as a GE spokesman, where, he had developed his tried and true tactic of using index cards, and he would write down arguments or facts or anecdotes, quotes, some accurate, some not, on index cards. And then he would shuffle those index cards before he gave a speech. So he never gave the same speech twice. And then he would judge the audience reaction. And the cards that resonated stayed in the pile. The ones that didn't resonate went in the trash can. And so by 1964, he had a highly honed speech. And the speech that he gave on behalf of Barry Goldwater was really one he had been developing for a decade. And it was a mesmerizing entrance into the national political arena for Ronald Reagan.
In 1966, Ronald Reagan will decide to run for governor against the sitting governor, Pat Brown. Was that Nancy's decision to do that? Did she welcome the governor's mansion?
No, it was really Ronald Reagan. I think it's a misnomer to say that Nancy Reagan had any great desire for her husband to go into politics. I don't think that's true. She would have been very happy to live a nice life in Beverly Hills, going out to lunch with her friends and staying far from politics. She did not have any particularly strong political views. The only reason that Reagan went into politics was because he was so interested in politics, and Nancy fully supported him because she knew how important that was to him. But she was not the driving force. She was certainly shaped his campaign and was an important advisor, but it was really Reagan himself who had the political interest, the political drive, the political ambition, even though he kind of camouflaged it and hid it behind this kind of aw shucks, Mr. Smith goes to Sacramento veneer, where he pretended that he was just, listening to the call of the people and answering the summons to serve. But in fact, it was really his political ambition that was the driving force.
First time I met Ronald Reagan as a politician was the spring summer of 1969, the People's Park. All of a sudden, this jovial, get along to go along actor turned into being a governor who issued an order to shoot. I have to say, Max, there was reason to believe shoot to kill at People's Park.
Well, there wasn't a shoot to kill order, but there was no question that the police during the People's Park demonstrations used excessive force, and a couple of people died. I mean, I think the handling of the college protests on California campuses, I think that was a low point in Reagan's tenure as governor because he was very confrontational. He had very hardline rhetoric saying that, if it takes a bloodbath to restore order, that's what we'll do if necessary. And he, in many ways, I mean, he didn't order a bloodbath. He didn't order any shoot to kill or anything like that. But he kind of escalated instead of trying to de-escalate. And he kind of gave the student radicals what they wanted, which was a confrontation with the establishment. And it was not a successful approach in terms of restoring order, but it was successful in terms of politically because, middle class Californians liked that he was getting tough with these supposed hippies and radicals on college campuses.
Richard Nixon is president, and Richard Nixon favored Ronald Reagan. And you present the plan that Ronald Reagan was to succeed Richard Nixon. Is that correct?
Well, that was certainly the plan in Ronald Reagan's mind. And he was, an avid supporter of Richard Nixon. Nixon himself did not have much respect for Reagan. And it's kind of amusing to listen to the White House tapes where Kissinger and Nixon talk about how stupid Reagan is, how he doesn't have any understanding of the world, he doesn't know what's going on. But nevertheless, Nixon didn't really respect Reagan, but he was afraid of him because he understood that Reagan was very popular, and so he tried to keep him happy and send him as an envoy to various right-wing dictators around the world. And Reagan was very, devoted to Nixon, such to the extent that during the Watergate scandal, Reagan was completely supportive of Nixon, claimed he had done nothing wrong. And, again, Reagan's expectation was that Nixon would serve 8 years, and then Reagan, after 2 successful terms as governor of California, would be seen as the natural successor. So Reagan was shocked in 1974 when Nixon had to resign from office and Jerry Ford became president, thereby seemingly blocking Reagan's own path to the White House and setting up this titanic primary showdown, which he launched.
The book is Reagan, His Life and Legend. Max Boot is the author. We continue the story with Ronald Reagan running for the presidency in 1976. Gerald Ford is in the White House, having ascended to the presidency at the resignation of Richard Nixon. And the challenge to Gerald Ford is in the primaries. Max tells the story extremely dramatically. The question is, at this point, Reagan was fine with the conservatives and looking to the center of the party. He came very close, Max. What was the opinion of the Reagan supporters at the time? Why he didn't overwhelm Gerald Ford? What was there a moment where he could have won it and didn't?
I mean, I think there were some moments when he could have won it and just, fell short. And I think the key one was early on in the New Hampshire primary, where he came very close to winning, but lost by something like 1,000 votes. But it's always very hard to unseat a president of your own party in the primaries, right? It's never happened during the open primary period of the post-World War II era. And Reagan came, in fact, closer than anybody else to pulling off that feat, where even after the primaries were over by the beginning of the summer of 1976, it still wasn't clear who had won, and both the Ford and Reagan campaigns were politicking right up until the convention to secure the delegates. And Ford did manage to secure the delegates, but then Reagan won the heart of the convention of the Republican Party with this very graceful and moving speech he gave in defeat at the convention. And a lot of people left that convention thinking that they had nominated the wrong man.
In the years between 76, Gerald Ford loses the presidency to Governor Carter of Georgia. The years between, Ronald Reagan goes back to his first love. He's on the radio. Was he doing the Saturday morning, or was he doing daily at that time, 76 to 80?
I think it was a couple of days a week that he was doing, but it's interesting because he was offered a chance to be on TV, I think even on 60 Minutes, top-rated show, but he instead chose to sign a radio contract because he feared that if he was on TV, he would be overexposed, whereas, he was somebody who believed in the power of radio, and so he did these short radio commentaries while Carter was in office.
And the Reagan decision in 1980 to run for the presidency. Again, I check in on Nancy Reagan because she's such a powerful figure and he trusts her so completely, his one good friend. Did she want to run for the White House?
Again, I think she would have been perfectly happy not to run. I think Reagan himself was the architect of his own presidential ambition, and he was certainly bucking the trend because a lot of people expected that after the 1976 primary loss, and he was 65 years old, people expected he would retire, but no, he came back at the ripe old age of 69 to seek the presidency.
We must mention the ranches. There have been a series of ranches. I don't have California in my head, so I don't know how far afield he's going. But you make the point, which makes me, again, hesitate about how complicated he is. He loved to get his hands dirty at the ranch. I remember lots of scenes of him cutting brush. I guess that's what he did for weekends. Is that where they would leave LA and go to brush cutting?
Yes, I mean during his presidency, whenever he had I mean, during weekends, they would normally go to Camp David, but when they had a slightly longer period of a week or so, he loved nothing better to go to his ranch outside of Santa Barbara. And it was fascinating because, Reagan was a guy who had basically no friends. And I found the person who was probably his closest friend as president, and somebody that nobody has ever heard of, a fellow named Dennis LeBlanc, who was a former California state policeman who protected Reagan when Reagan was governor. And then after Reagan left the governorship, Dennis LeBlanc and another former cop named Barney Barnett went to work with Reagan as basically his ranch hands at this ranch. And Reagan loved nothing better than to spend time with Dennis and Barney, clearing brush, painting fences, doing ranch chores. Those were actually the people that he most loved to associate with in the entire world. It wasn't all these Alfred Bloomingdales and Walter Annenbergs and these other magnates that he was often photographed with. It was these kind of down-to-earth blue-collar guys who had been California cops.
And was he cutting brush between 76 and 80 before the White House? Was he doing it at that?
Oh, yes. No, absolutely. He was not only that, he was actually reconstructing his farmhouse, and it was a very primitive affair, and it still remained pretty rustic, but he did a lot of the reconstruction and expansion work himself.
The run for the presidency, John Sears and Bill Casey. Who are they, Max? What do we need to know about them?
Well, John Sears was Reagan's campaign manager in 1976 and then in the first part of the 1980 campaign. And he was kind of a political genius, but one who eventually grated on the Reagans in part because of his demands for total control. And so he started purging a lot of the Californians from the campaign, people like Mike Deaver and Ed Meese, who were very close to Reagan personally. And that really grated on Ronald and Nancy Reagan. And Reagan did not establish a close rapport with John Sears. And so on the day of the New Hampshire primary in 1980, which Reagan won, Reagan did something that he almost never did. He fired John Sears, and generally he hated to fire anybody, still traumatized by his father's unemployment in the 1930s, but he was fed up enough with John Sears to fire him and to run or to be campaign manager, campaign chairman. Nancy brought in Bill Casey, who was a guy who had very little experience in politics. He had been an OSS spy during World War II and then had been a pretty successful lawyer on Wall Street and Republican fundraiser. And she brought him in to oversee the campaign after the firing of John Sears.
And Bill Casey, he is the alleged October surprise. It's Casey. Is that it?
Yes. I mean, the October surprise was the name for this theory that the Reagan campaign reached out to Iran before the 1980 election to basically signal to the Iranians that they should not release the American hostages prior to the election, which would have boosted Jimmy Carter and might have won the presidency for him. And I found it's not ironclad evidence, but I found pretty strong evidence that this probably happened. And it wasn't anything that Ronald Reagan himself was aware of. The culprit was Bill Casey, who was this former OSS spy who had great devotion to various plots and conspiracies, and he was the one who was meeting with Iranian emissaries.
The campaign is very close that summer. The polls show no gap at all until we come to the September, October. The economy is in very sad shape. At the same time, there's a debate very late in October, I believe. Is there a moment where the gap opened up between them, or was that a surprise on Election Day, Max?
No, I think the gap opened up weeks before the election. I think the debate was certainly a turning point because, Reagan was such a polished television performer. He really wiped the floor with Jimmy Carter, and he had that one famous line in the debate, "There you go again," which was really a knockout blow, even though what people forget is that Carter was right and Reagan was wrong, because the prelude to that remark was Carter accusing Reagan of having opposed Medicare, which was true. Reagan had opposed Medicare in the early 1960s. He had warned it was socialized medicine would lead to the end of freedom in America. But Reagan said, "There you go again," and claimed he hadn't really opposed Medicare, that he'd backed another bill that was just as good, even though it wasn't. The other bill would have only covered about 1% of seniors as opposed to all of them. And so on the facts, Carter was right, Reagan was wrong, but it didn't matter because it was such an effective rhetorical blow. And, uh, he won the debate and won the election.
Max Boot, the author of Reagan, His Life and Legend. It is a cloudy day, is my memory, in early spring 1981. Ronald Reagan makes a speech in Washington. He's leaving the building. Shots are fired, and Reagan is hit. A number of other members of his staff are hit. And this becomes a crisis that Max presents very dramatically. This is 69 days into the administration, and Reagan conducts himself heroically with humor and attempting to ease the tension all around him, especially his wife, who is, as Nancy rushes to the hospital to be with him, he is very close to death often, several times. Max's presentation is extremely moving. At the same time, Max, I'm interested in what happens afterwards. He recovers amazingly, and that leads to success in Washington. What is it that allows him to then move on his domestic ambitions so quickly?
Well, I call the chapter on his shooting finest hour, and it really was Reagan's finest hour. Remember, this was Reagan had never been in combat. He'd spent all of World War II on a soundstage, but here he was acting very heroically after being shot and joking with the doctors, saying, "I hope you're all Republicans," telling Nancy, "Honey, I forgot to duck." And of course, people were horrified by the shooting. And he came very close to death, much closer than his aides had let on at the time. But then when people heard about how he had behaved after being shot, and he'd really behaved, kind of like a wisecracking Warner Brothers hero of the 1930s, except this was not a soundstage. This was not scripted. This was real life. Being shot hurt a lot. He was close to death, but he kept his good humor. He kept his head about him, and I think that gave him a huge popularity boost and really cemented this bond between Ronald Reagan and the American people that really lasted throughout his presidency. And the most immediate political benefit was a boost in his popularity rating and also a huge boost in the chances of passage for his first budget, which cut spending and cut taxes. And the prospects for Reaganomics when Reagan was shot were still very much uncertain. But after, he came back to the White House, he spoke to a joint session of Congress where people gave him rapturous applause. And by that point, it was kind of a foregone conclusion that his program was going to sail through Congress.
Yes, again and again, Max, you are very detailed on what the facts are in the economy and what the Laffer curve does and what Reaganomics does. But I'm reminded again and again about the Hollywood line. I believe William Goldman wrote it for The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. When the facts replace the legend, print the legend. That's Ronald Reagan speechifying. He's,
Yes,
he speaks legend, not facts.
yes, absolutely. And Reagan's superpower was kind of the ability to see the world as he wanted it to be, not necessarily as it was, but also to convince other people that to see the world the way he saw it. And one example of that, if you cite Reaganomics, is that he, his program was to cut taxes dramatically and raise defense spending dramatically. But while doing that, he also expected that he would eliminate the budget deficit. And no serious economist thought you could possibly do that. But Reagan convinced himself that cutting taxes would actually stimulate so much economic activity that the government would actually get more money than it had at a higher tax rate. And that, of course, turned out not to be true. And so when he left the presidency, the one regret that he expressed was he said he was very sorry that the budget deficit had gone up because he had promised to balance the budget by 1983. Never happened. Instead, budget deficit is larger than ever. But it's kind of amazing that he ever imagined that a program of tax cuts and spending increases could possibly result in a balanced budget. But yet he did. And this was something he became very convinced of.
The Troika, we need to name them because they were so powerful in the first term. All the work in the first term pays off, but it's their agenda. And we're talking about the domestic agenda. We'll come to the foreign policy in a moment. James Baker, Ed Meese, and Mike Deaver are responsible for the success of the first term. Is it because they cut down or they eliminated people getting access to the president. Is that the secret? Because there have been presidencies since where they're back and forth about access to the president. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Well, I think the big picture, I would say Ronald Reagan was a great leader, but he was a poor manager. He was not somebody who was deep into the weeds of government policy, and he really needed people who could manage for him. And he found that with, I think it was really Jim Baker, who was by far the most important of the Troika. And the appointment of Jim Baker, I think, was actually in many ways the most important decision that Reagan made as president. Very unexpected because normally presidents appoint some crony as their White House chief of staff. But Baker had, in fact, worked against Reagan, had worked for Ford in 76, had worked for Bush in 1980, and yet Reagan still appointed him. And then, of course, Reagan still wanted a place for his old California aides, Ed Meese and Mike Deaver. And so thereby he created the Troika. And many people initially expected that Ed Meese, who was seen as being more conservative and more doctrinaire than Jim Baker, many people expected that Ed Meese would emerge as the most powerful member of the Troika because he had been Reagan's chief of staff in Sacramento. But in fact, that turned out not to be the case at all because Ed Meese was very disorganized, not very clued into the ways of Washington, whereas Jim Baker, nicknamed the Velvet Hammer, became one of the shrewdest operators Washington had ever seen. And Mike Deaver, who was an old advertising man and really Reagan's image meister, he threw his influence behind Baker. And so the talk of the Troika was really misleading because it wasn't three equal power centers. It was really Baker accumulating more and more power as the presidency went on, and Meese being more and more sidelined.
The other significant achievement in the first 2 years, it is August of 1981, and Ronald Reagan made a remark during the campaign about a woman on the Supreme Court, and he does it, Sandra Day O'Connor. And that was seen as a great success at the time. Is that accurate, Max? We have about a minute.
Yes, absolutely. He had agreed to appoint a woman because he, like many other Republicans, he faced a gender gap, and he appointed Sandra Day O'Connor, even though many right-wingers were fearful that she would vote to uphold Roe v. Wade, which ultimately she did. But Reagan was not an absolutist at all and didn't really care that much about abortion. His primary concern was about not setting criminals free, and he bonded with O'Connor over her background growing up on a ranch, and so he was delighted to appoint her.
I smiled when you reported the Senate vote 99-0.
Yeah, hard to imagine today, right?
It's impossible, Max. 99-0. I also like the fact that Senator Day O'Connor's name emerged because she was, as you describe him, an old flame of what becomes Chief Justice Rehnquist. Was he on the court at the time? He was, wasn't he?
Yes, he was, yeah.
So Sandra Day O'Connor joins, and the domestic achievement of the taxes and the deregulation, and Ronald Reagan telling a story that the American people wanted to hear. Going to turn to the Cold War. This is Reagan, his life and legend. Max Boot is the author. All these years later, it's good to review what we lived through, we boomers. And you Gen Xers, you were children, and you Gen Zers, you weren't here yet. But this is the man that everybody rolls their eyes and goes, Ronald Reagan, the great communicator. Well, he was. He knew how to tell stories. But when you meet foreign policy, the stories only go as far as what happens later. It's surprising to me, Max, how many of these challenges in the 2 terms of Ronald Reagan are still with us. Iran, still with us. Afghanistan, still with us. The troubles in the Caribbean, Havana, Nicaragua. El Salvador seems to be solved, but Central America is not. Still with us. It's only 40 years. Poland is somewhat solved. That was a major challenge because it was under the Soviet boot. Let's talk about the Soviets. Ronald Reagan had no patience whatsoever with communism. And yet, he became a person who wanted, it's not détente. It's not Richard Nixon's détente. It goes back and forth between being confrontational and looking to do business about treaties. How should we think about him in the Soviet Union?
Well, I would say that in his first term, he had a somewhat muddled and unsuccessful policy towards the Soviet Union. The most high-profile elements were his confrontational tactics and rhetoric. He boosted U.S. defense spending massively. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. But he was also at the same time behind the scenes trying to reach out to the Soviets and trying to establish channels of communication because he was very worried about the danger of nuclear Armageddon. That was something that, in fact, was an obsession with him. But as he later complained, I wanted to meet with the Soviet leader, but they kept dying on me. And during his first term, he dealt with these decrepit geriatric leaders like Brezhnev and then Andropov and Chernenko. And things only really began to turn around with this policy towards the Soviet Union in 1985, when the younger and more dynamic Mikhail Gorbachev came to office. Gorbachev was really a black swan, somebody who wanted to reform this dictatorial system even as he rose to the top of it. And as I argue in the book, I don't think that Gorbachev's desires to reform were driven by Ronald Reagan. Gorbachev was not trying to keep up with the U.S. defense buildup. He, in fact, wanted to end the arms race and to spend money on social concerns. But I think Reagan's achievement was not in bringing Gorbachev to power or forcing the Soviet Union to reform. His achievement was in recognizing that Gorbachev was a different kind of communist leader, somebody he could do business with, as Margaret Thatcher told him. And they established a rapport at their first summit in Geneva in 1985 that I think changed history. And that allowed Reagan and Gorbachev to work together to reduce nuclear armaments and to peacefully end the Cold War. And I think that's in many ways the ultimate tribute to Reagan's pragmatism, because few would have expected that this hardline anti-communist who had been warning about the dangers of the Soviet Union since the 1940s, that he would be establishing a friendship with the world's number one communist and working so constructively with him. But that is in fact what Reagan did.
You mentioned Margaret Thatcher. They were great, great, great friends. And Brian Mulrooney, those were the two leaders you identify as Reagan getting on famously with. I love the scene of Mulrooney and Reagan singing When Irish Eyes Are Shining together.
Right.
Is there a video of that, Max?
Probably. I'm not sure, but probably, yeah.
It'd be charming to listen to all these years later. Now, about the Soviet Union. There were two documents, National Security Document 32 and 75. That's his staff. That's not Reagan, because those are confrontational documents.
Yeah, those were produced by Bill Clark, his national security advisor, for part of his first term, and they were confrontational. They called for a policy of confronting and bringing down the Soviet Union, but the actual implementation was much more varied. I mean, for example, one of the very first things Reagan did in 1981 was to lift the grain embargo that Jimmy Carter had imposed on the Soviets after the invasion of Afghanistan. So, these national security documents are often cited as kind of a blueprint for bringing down the Soviet Union. And because the Soviet Union eventually fell a few years later, a lot of people try to draw a causal connection. But in fact, I think it's much more complicated than that. In fact, I asked George Shultz, who was Reagan's Secretary of State, I said, Mr. Shultz, did the Reagan administration have a plan to bring down the Soviet Union? And he said, no, I wish we did, but we didn't.
Change in personnel is significant to flag here. The Chief of Staff, James Baker, for the second term goes to Treasury. And Don Regan, who is a Wall Street magnate, joins as Chief of Staff. And you make it very clear he might not be the worst chief of staff ever, but he's in competition. What didn't work?
Well, as Jim Baker said to me, Don Regan, who had been a former CEO of Merrill Lynch, Don Regan liked the chief part of the title, but he didn't understand that he was staff, and he really thought that he was the decision maker and not the president. And maybe that would have been okay if Regan had tremendous political instincts, but in fact, he had horrible political instincts. And, as I mentioned, in many ways, the best decision of Reagan's presidency was making Jim Baker the White House chief of staff. In many ways, the worst decision was casually allowing Jim Baker and Don Regan to swap jobs at the beginning of the second term. That made no sense because Don Regan turned out to be this awful chief of staff who presided over one problem after another, ultimately culminating in the Iran-Contra scandal.
There are number of problems that result from Don Regan's management. There are successes too, and Max goes in Max covers all this in great detail. I regret leaving out things, but I wanted to make sure that we mention Hezbollah. It's born at the Marine Barrack. Well, it's born at the U.S. Embassy bombing in 83 and then the Marine Barracks bombing in 83. That leads to dealing with Iran in an unusual fashion. Is there any way to characterize how Ronald Reagan thought of Iran? Did he think he could bring it in from the cold?
Well, unfortunately, the Reagan administration's dealings with Iran were a fiasco. Not very unusual because that's true of many presidents since 1980. But yes, I mean, he sent in the peacekeepers who were blown up at the barracks in Beirut in 1983, then pulled them out. But then what happened was Hezbollah, as the organization became known, began seizing American hostages, and Reagan was very exercised about the fate of the hostages. He wanted to get them out. And his then national security advisor, Bud McFarlane, suggested that there were these supposed moderates in Iran that we could deal with. We could ship them weapons. In return, they would release the hostages, and Iran itself would take a more moderate pro-American direction. And of course, this blew up in their face because the Iranians took the weapons, they released a few hostages, but then they seized more hostages. And then this moved from the realm of an unsuccessful policy to a great scandal when John Poindexter, who succeeded Bud McFarlane as national security advisor, and his aide, Oliver North, decided to take the profits from the sale of weapons to Iran and to funnel the profits to the Contras in Nicaragua, these anti-communist rebels, even though Congress had passed the Boland Amendment forbidding aid to the Contras. And so this was a scandal that blew up in Reagan's face in 1986. He could have actually been impeached because of it, but ultimately his salvation was the fact that he was so hands off. I mean, because he was so hands off, he got into the scandal, but he also got out of it because his defense was, I did not know about the diversion of money to the Contras. Now, if Richard Nixon had said that, nobody would have believed him because everybody knew that Nixon knew everything that was going on. But with Reagan saying, I didn't know what was going on, is very believable because everybody knew what a disengaged, hands-off manager he was. But this was kind of a near-death experience for the Reagan administration from which the president just barely emerged.
Philippines, Haiti, and South Africa all illustrate different parts of Reagan, especially about South Africa. He never spoke for the victims, or he did not speak for the victims of apartheid, clearly. Is that correct, Max?
Yeah, I think that's basically true. And as one of his own appointees pointed out to me, he had kind of a double standard because he spoke very eloquently about human rights violations by the Soviet Union and behind the Iron Curtain, but he was not so exercised about the human rights violations of apartheid, and in fact vetoed a very tough sanctions bill passed by Congress, and Congress wound up overriding his veto. So that was not a proud moment for the Reagan administration.
And I mentioned Manila because Paul Laxalt was a determinative, the Marcos dictatorship. All these decades later, Marcos is back in, but this time it's a descendant. There's a strong relationship with the United States. Haiti, 40 years later, it's worse than ever, Max. Did they have a chance after Duvalier left to solve that, or was it always going to be the anarchy we saw today?
Oh gosh, it was probably always going to be a mess. But the fall of Marcos was interesting because Marcos tried to steal an election. There was a massive people power uprising, and initially Reagan was very friendly to Marcos. He had known him since his time as governor of California, but he was then convinced by Paul Laxalt and George Shultz and others that Marcos could not stay in power, and this became part of a trend of Reagan promoting democracy and even willing to see the overthrow of right-wing dictatorships instead of simply highlighting the excesses of left-wing dictatorships. This was kind of the beginnings of a more pro-democracy agenda in the Reagan administration and the Republican Party.
The book is Reagan. The late Reagan administration is troubled in all directions for foreign policy. Domestic policy seems to be on overdrive. We have Max mentions a number of books that were popular in the 1980s. I'd forgotten about them. Lesson Zero, I'd forgotten that was the 1980s. And I mention all of that because we come to the departure of Ronald Reagan from the White House. I can remember seeing a video of the helicopter flying away. So I wanted to review some of his most famous statements and where they came from. Honey, I forgot to duck. Where did he get that, Max? Did he make it up at the spot?
I think it was an old Hollywood movie line that he quoted at the exact right moment.
To Nancy Reagan. And the one
Oh,
back,
actually, it wasn't a movie line. I think it was a boxing line. It was Jack Dempsey, I think, or some other boxer of the 1920s who said that after losing a fight.
and Ash Heap of History. Was that Reagan original?
Um, yeah, that was from the 1983 Westminster Address. Um, I think that was Reagan repurposing communist rhetoric against the Soviet Union.
Yes, it magnified the expectations. And there you go again. Is that Reagan original at the one and only debate with Mr. Carter?
That was a Reagan original, yes.
And of course, I love the remark he makes about Alzheimer's as the diagnosis has been made clear to him. He cared a great deal about what happens to Nancy. Post-presidency, he moved into an office where he remained as pleasant as ever, always looking on the bright side of things. And he had chance to reflect. I think you make a distinction, Max, between the book that Nancy Reagan wrote and the book that Ronald Reagan wrote. And I get the impression, having never read either of them, that Nancy Reagan's book can be helpful, but Ronald Reagan's is not to a biographer such as yourself. Is that correct? There were no details in there worth repeating.
Well, no, I think you're referring to their diaries. Nancy Reagan's diary, she used it for to write her memoir and then destroyed it. So nobody has read it. The Reagan diary, Ronald Reagan's diary, was published and it was useful. I mean, no question about it, because it was a day by day recounting of his presidency, but it was not very deep or reflective. It was really basically him taking his daily schedule and offering a few thoughts on, but everything was great and grand and good. And he was just such a relentlessly upbeat person that there was, not much psychological insight to be found from his, or very limited psychological insight to be found from his diary, I guess I would say.
That makes you into a detective, Max. That's how I thought of you in reading the book. You had a case, you knew where it was going, but you had to walk the cat backwards to the
Yeah.
beginning.
I mean, Reagan was somebody where even Nancy Reagan said that part of him was walled off even from her, and his closest aides said that he was very hard to know. So it's definitely a major challenge for any biographer.
Genial and aloof. And that was a term that everybody understood about Ronald Reagan. But no one complained, genial and aloof. And I puzzle now that you can reflect on this enormous amount of work you've done. Was that from the childhood? Was that because he'd learned to, as an actor, to turn his emotions on and off depending on the part? Where did he first understand that that was a defensive mechanism that would always serve him?
Well, I trace it back to his childhood, where again he didn't really get close to the other kids because they were moving all the time because his father kept losing one job after another. He didn't want people to know about his dad's drinking, and so he was kind of aloof from everybody. Kind of erected this mental wall around himself. And what I figured out is that he certainly came across as genial, but his anecdotes and stories, his jokes and quips, they were actually a way to keep people at a safe remove. He kept conversations at a very superficial level and never delved deep with anybody. Didn't even know what was going on with his kids' lives, for example, or his aides. But everybody was happy to spend time with him.
His own memory, I think I have this right, Max. His own memory of what he achieved was the economic recovery of the first term and the morale of the United States. Let's deal with the economic recovery. I don't have the statistics in front of me. They're in Max's book, but the recovery is largely salesmanship. I mean, it was okay coming out of a recession, but it wasn't what we remember today through the fog of history, which is the spectacular growth of the 1980s. I believe you make the case that it's happened before.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at economic growth rates during the Reagan presidency, they were actually pretty similar to the Nixon administration, not only a tiny bit higher than Carter and below that of the Bill Clinton administration. But his political timing was exquisite because there was a severe recession from 1981 to 1983, but by the time Reagan was running for re-election in 1984, growth shot up to 7% that year, and then it fell back down to earth. But it was that towering economic performance in 1984 that allowed him to win 49 states.
And luck, you mentioned luck. He was a very lucky politician, or did he take advantage of where he had luck and walked away from where he didn't? How do you see it, Max?
I think he was a very lucky politician, but he also made his own luck and figured out how to take advantage of it. And the fact that the economic recovery, I think a lot of it was due to Paul Volcker, and the chairman of the Fed, who raised interest rates to take the inflation out of the economy. But Reagan supported Volcker, which was not easy to do. There was a lot of political blowback, and his popularity plunged in 1982. Democrats won the midterm elections, but he stayed the course and, received the political rewards in 1984.
I tell a story that Max tells about one of the early weeks in the White House when he went into the Oval Office, the first day or second day. The resolute desk that the president sit behind. It was made out of timbers from a famous ship. But Ronald Reagan had a chair, I believe, from California.
Right.
And when he sat in his chair, because he's a tall man, he couldn't get his knees under the desk. He didn't complain. He sat sideways. It wasn't for some days or weeks, I can't remember which, Max, until somebody recognized that they could lift the desk up and make it 2 inches higher. Did he ever comment on that, Max, that the desk now fit him as it hadn't before? Who did this?
Maybe he did. I'm not aware of it, but that's really an example. That was one of the secrets of his success. He was so modest, so unassuming, so undemanding. He was, a hard guy to hate, basically. And even people who disagreed with his policies had to grudgingly say that they liked Reagan personally because he had such a winning personality. And, despite all of his success, he always remained very down to earth.
And the Great Communicator, was he comfortable with that as a way of remembering him?
I think he was, although it sometimes had a sliding inference to suggest that he was just a guy who read a script, which wasn't the case at all. He often wrote his own scripts. And, he was, one of his great lines was, he was asked, he said, some people say they can't understand how an actor can be president. I don't understand how anybody but an actor could be president. And he certainly understood how to use the bully pulpit better than just about anybody who has ever occupied the office.
The book is Reagan, His Life and Legend. Max Boot is the author. I'm John Batchelor.